Now, I wanted to say a few more things about the Depression, because even though the last video I made on it was like 13 minutes long, obviously that is not enough to address the topic. However, I found myself, when I was thinking about it, I just kept thinking more about World War II generally, and I thought that, I don't know, I feel like it'd be hard to really address the Depression, how it ended, FDR and all that, without really talking more about World War II. And I think I wanted to start off by saying, in my opinion, and this is to a large extent, not a fact, but in my opinion, World War II is probably the single most catastrophic event in American history. Now, in terms of world history, in terms of the number of people killed, yeah, no brainer. World War II is the worst thing. However, World War II's scope went far beyond the American experience. It was basically a number of wars, and the United States was involved in some of them, and not that much to a certain extent. I mean, in the Pacific theater, we were one of the main antagonists, but we didn't take that much part in China. We didn't take that much part in the war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which was, by the way, where the vast majority of the fighting that the Germans did was against the Russians. Now, when I say this, there are two other episodes that I think are also absolutely catastrophic for America. One is the Civil War, and the other is, I guess you would say, either World War I or the Progressive Era, or the administration of Woodrow Wilson. That time period. Some people will say the year 1913. And I think the Civil War comes out as maybe it deserves, just by virtue of the number of Americans who died, to be considered worse, because more than twice, or something about twice as many died, although in recent years the number of people who died in World War II, I've noticed, has upped about 100,000. It used to be, I always heard 300,000, now I hear closer to 4. I don't know if somebody just did a new study, or if they're counting people who are dying now from wounds or what, I don't know. But even then, it would still be by a fraction smaller than the Civil War. But the reason I don't consider those episodes as catastrophic is because after each of them, there was a return to normalcy, and they also, largely a return to normalcy. And they did not affect the psyche of the United States, at least in terms of the efficacy of the federal government in particular, and government in general also, nearly as much as World War II. So if you look at the Civil War, I mean, obviously I come down on the side of secession, and Lincoln was a tyrant and all that. But if you think about it, when the war ended, very little changed, really, formally, in terms of the power of the federal government. Now, we can argue about the 14th Amendment and the whole United States are versus the United States is, and just the, now secession isn't seemingly legal, although they actually never clarified that. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned, and the radical Republicans wanted to try him, and then they ended up just releasing him without trial because they were not sure how the court would decide. And beyond this, a number of war measures that were enacted during the Civil War were basically repealed. So the income tax, obviously the Union went off the gold standard and it returned to the gold standard. An amazing case of during the war, I'm probably remembering this wrong, I think it was Stanton. Someone in Lincoln's cabinet later went on to be in the Supreme Court, and when he was in the cabinet, he said something to the effect of, "This is only a short-term measure, the suspension of payment in gold, and we won't do it forever." And for someone like me, when the government says something like that, it's almost guaranteed to be a lie. However, he went on to be in the Supreme Court and actually said, "Yeah, I meant it. It was only a short-term thing. Now it's totally unconstitutional. We can't do that anymore." If you look at the Wilsonian, progressive World War I era, obviously the number of people killed is far less. Many institutions, they actually preceded World War I. If you look at the Fed, the income tax, Most of that stuff actually came just before World War I, although it came after Wilson's election in 1912. And although those institutions survived, I think the really important thing from that event, especially World War I, is the American populace did not change their attitudes towards government. In fact, World War I left a really bad taste in people's mouths, and they realized, hey, this was a bad idea. 100,000 Americans died. Who knows how many people they killed? And for no reason. I mean, just tipped the balance, and two imperial powers were able to subdue another imperial power, and on the side, another empire fell and was replaced by what is easily the worst government in the history of the world, the USSR. I mean, Imperial France and Imperial Britain, both empires, colonial empires that reached their zenith after World War I, and largely because of World War I, because they absorbed the German colonies and also the former Ottoman colonies, especially in the Levant. What good came of this? Now, it's true that the institutions survived, but I think it's very important to realize that the American public didn't really change their mind. They didn't say, hey, you know, this foreign aggrandizement, this is good. Actually, they came to the correct counter conclusion that it was bad. Now, this is different when it comes to World War II. There was never a return to normalcy. It did ratchet down some, and in neither of the other two did the government really go back to what it had been before, but it went a lot farther than it did after the Civil War and World War I than it did after World War II. But the main thing is that the population largely changed its idea. The non-interventionist, non-imperial, I would say, mindset, we don't think of it as imperial, but that mindset was basically discredited. And I think this is a huge tragedy. I think it's reliant on a very it's not a false version of history, but it's a version of history that omits a great deal, and it runs something along the lines of if we didn't get involved, why we didn't have a choice because we were attacked, and that is true, we were attacked. We pardon the use of the pronoun we there, that you'll understand. However, we weren't neutral. That's the large thing, and people, this isn't really debated. This isn't a conspiracy theorist that you might only hear on Alex Jones. It's well known that the United States was actively aiding certain countries as opposed to others. And again, people think it's axiomatic. Obviously, you would have to oppose the Nazis. Why? I mean, here again, the British, it's an empire. It has a royal family. They have a colonial empire. They exploit. I mean, the whole thing is the Germans are attempting to create their own colonial empire, and yet the established colonial empire is okay. You know, France and Great Britain, and beyond this, the timing is a little difficult because originally Germany and the USSR were allies. Germany invaded the USSR on June 22nd, 1941. That's before the United States was attacked on Pearl Harbor. It's after FDR was doing everything he could to get into the war. But in any event, the USSR became our great ally, and they benefited more from the war probably than anybody else, and they are worse than the Nazis. I don't think that's too controversial to say that. And if you look on the other side, you have the Imperial Japanese. It's true, also a very horrible military regime. But who were they fighting? They were fighting the Chinese. You had two groups, the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. I think most of my viewers will understand that the Communists were bad. Mao, one of those guys who you could even say is worse than Stalin or Hitler. But he's in that three, you know, the three most evil ever. But a lot of people don't realize is that Chiang was he was actually very close to that also. The fact that he was fighting the communists does not belie any kind of adherence to classical liberal thinking or believing in human rights or free markets or anything like that. You could say he maybe was the lesser of two evils, but he was still a bloodthirsty dictator and a horrible man, and his rule over China wasn't probably any worse than the Japanese rule over China. I'm not saying I favor one or the other. I'm just saying it's not like the Justice League on one side and the Legion of Doom on the other. We've got everybody is a bloody butcher, and just assuming that, well, we had to take one of those sides, I don't see it. The other argument is that, even if, say, the British and all them are evil, we had to worry about being invaded ourselves. I have an uncle, he's a pretty smart guy, an objectivist, but the stuff he talks about when it comes to World War II, it's a common idea. It's nuts. He thinks that the Germans were going to take over all of Eurasia with the Japanese, and they take over the whole world except for the Western Hemisphere, and then they launch their legions against the Western Hemisphere. And I've heard accusations that this may have been a plan, although one has to qualify what a plan is. Militaries and governments make plans for everything, basically, and that doesn't mean that they are on the cusp of attempting, let alone achieving them. And it's going to take more than Hitler's secret unpublished book or something from the colonial office in Tokyo to convince me that this is something we should really worry about. And even if they really were seriously considering it, it's just, it's crazy to say, oh, once they conquered Eurasia, how? Nobody ever has conquered Eurasia. Not the Mongols, not the Romans, not Alexander the Great, not the British, not the Chinese, not anybody. And yet, oh, it's just going to happen now, easily. This, as history showed, the Germans did not have the power to assert themselves over European Russia, let alone all of Asia. The Chinese, I used to always imagine, why didn't the Chinese just conquer, why didn't they just attack the Soviet Union too and conquer the rest of China? Why did they only conquer part of it? That's because it's fucking hard to occupy all those areas, and they were majorly committed, and they already had bitten off more than they could chew, even before Pearl Harbor, in terms of long-term, which, by the way, the Japanese didn't intend. They wanted to set up sympathetic governments in the areas they conquered, and as long as the people in those areas weren't going to go for that, then they had to occupy, and that's something they knew they could never do forever. And the same can be said for the German occupations of Eastern Europe. So the idea that we were, if we didn't get involved then, this is kind of similar to the terrorists. If we didn't fight them over there, we'd be fighting them over here. It's science fiction. It's asinine. Is it theoretically possible? I suppose, but it would be completely ahistorical, and it would also be, in hindsight, we know that it just never could have happened. They were unable to. Germany was unable to conquer all of Europe. And to conquer what it did by having alliances and ruling, kind of with it had many allies: Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. It had tacit support from countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and it couldn't. For those who don't know, well, I'll come to that later. But it was unnecessary for America to get involved, and it was an unmitigated disaster, despite the fact that our nominal enemies were defeated.